Leadership in Challenging Times is the overall title, of course, of the day, but also this specific session, and it's to be moderated by Rob Goffee, who is the Professor of Organisational Behaviour here at the London Business School. And he has been Deputy Dean and Governor, Director of the Innovation Exchange, Faculty Director of Executive Education. He is widely published, 10 books, 70 articles in a whole wide series of areas, and the recipient of the coveted McKinsey Award for the best article in Harvard Business Review. So as business journalism comes, doesn't get more blue chip than that. Rob, join us please, and introduce your panel.
Good afternoon. Can I just say straight away, I'm never happy following a comedian, but it's very nice to be here this afternoon, and it's my pleasure to very briefly, before we start, introduce the panel, say something about the approach we'd like to have on this panel, and then finally some words about the actual topic that we have, Leadership in Challenging Times, which is actually, of course, the title of the whole day, but it's an area we're focusing on in a particular kind of way with this panel. Three gentlemen here, little introduction I suspect is needed, but John Connolly on my far left, Global Chairman of Deloitte and Senior Partner and CEO of Deloitte in the UK. Very well known to us here at the school. Spent his entire career, with Deloitte in various positions in the UK, and sometimes it may feel like that, but in the UK and internationally. Ben Verwaayen, currently CEO of Alcatel-Lucent, probably Ben best known here in the UK in his previous role as CEO of BT Group, having previously worked with Lucent Technologies pre-BT, now headquartered with his organisation in Paris. Willie Walsh, CEO of British Airways. You may have read a bit about him and his company in the press recently, and I suspect it may be connected to some of the things, at least, that he's going to speak about this afternoon. Worked earlier with Aer Lingus, moving all the way through, interestingly, from cadet pilot to chief executive. So clearly you're going to hear three distinctive voices from three distinctive sectors: professional services, communications, the airline industry. But despite these differences, I'm sure they share several things. First, as you've now heard, each of them carry, I think, a wealth of deep, lengthy experience from their respective sectors. All of them, as CEOs, will have seen at least some of these challenges before, yet may see some differences now, and they may wish to talk about them. I'm sure all of them will also wish to look forward as they prepare for the upturn and shape their organisations accordingly. All of them I have asked to focus on some of the personal and the human and the organisational challenges of leadership under these conditions. We've had a couple of panels already this morning. Many of you will have heard them. They've focused primarily on the finance and the economics of where we are. We had more of a focus on the human and organisational challenges of leadership. Can I just say one other thing by way of introduction of the panel in terms of the human angle? I noticed they all, rather impressively at this level, seem to have a life outside work. And the life outside work, curiously, includes a shared passion for soccer. John's a Manchester United fan. Ben's an Arsenal supporter. Willie supports Liverpool. I too share this passion for soccer, but I'm not prepared to reveal my allegiance in front of several hundred people. It can be rather painful in my experience. And please don't reveal it, you guys know. Okay, so the approach we'd like to take, if you were here this morning, you'll have seen that the panels were fairly large. We've got the advantage of being relatively small. There's three speakers after me, and clearly we'd like to introduce this topic pretty briefly, and we'd like to turn this very swiftly into a discussion with you. So please think about questions, observations, remarks that you'd like to make when the four of us have had our say. Lastly, something about the topic itself. whatever conclusions we come to today or elsewhere about the scale or the causes of this crisis, it's likely, I suspect, that first of all leadership's more important than ever, that organisations that are well led will have a better chance of survival in turbulent times, and now is not the time, I think, to turn your eye away from the critical processes of leadership development, not just leadership development. And smart organisations know this, and forgive me if that sounds like an advert for London Business School, but I really do believe it. The smart organisations won't turn their attention away from leadership or leadership development. If you were here this morning, I'm about to say something, there's an interesting comment from Jeff Immelt, but I'm about to say there's no recipe for good leadership. And if you listened carefully to some things Jeff was saying this morning, he made a remarkable comment, at least in my view, a remarkable comment. He was talking about what kind of leader do we need for the 21st century. And he said, I quote, "I'm not sure." And if you know anything about Jeff and GE and its huge investment in leadership and leadership development, I think it's absolutely fascinating that someone like him should come along this morning and say, leaders for the 21st century? I'm not sure. We're thinking it through carefully. My co-author and I, Gareth Jones and myself, contributed something to the Financial Times recently, talking about leadership in a downturn, and we tried to talk very briefly about some pitfalls. There may be no neat recipe, but there may be some pitfalls to avoid, and I'm just going to very quickly allude to some of the pitfalls, and some of my members of the panel here may wish to respond on at least some of them. Here comes some pitfalls to avoid as leaders. First, don't claim to know the future. You don't, but do articulate a vision which gives people integrity, hope, and an optimistic future. Secondly, understand the politics. When organisations are in difficulties, they tend to contract. When they contract, they become political. Understand the politics, but remain above them. In my view, Barack Obama, in his campaign, don't know the future, but give people integrity and hope. Understand the politics, was absolutely exemplary, but remain above them, absolutely exemplary on both these factors. Third factor, focus relentlessly on the task and quickly, but don't use the current circumstances to ignore the fact that you need organisational cohesion. In other words, that you need to keep talking and listening. Fourthly, identify with your employees, mobilise them, to use Jeff Immelt's comments again this morning, but always be prepared to take a step back at the right moment to do the hard stuff. In other words, to say no, not just yes. 5, remain steadfast around your core values, but don't use this as a way of ignoring the need to be adaptable, nimble, responsive under the current circumstances. I'm sure those will be the winning organisations, those that can respond. 6, as a leader, be yourself. Be your authentic self. Don't try and be anybody else. It's a theme close to my heart, but recognise under these different and difficult circumstances, you may have different and difficult roles to play, particularly as a chief executive, perhaps. And finally, 7th, and finally, admit mistakes. You may make more of them under these difficult conditions. Say sorry where necessary, and when you do, try and look as if you mean it. UK, perhaps, politicians and bankers might wish to take note. But as a business school professor, I suspect the 7 things I've just said may be truly easier said than done. But it is when organisations are in difficulties that their true commitment to core values are most severely tested. And in addition, in a world which is awash with information overload, the leader's voice, I think, must be distinctive in order to excite others to exceptional performance. We have the privilege of 3 distinctive voices from 3 distinctive sectors. And I'm going to hand the floor to them now, and John is going to speak first. Do remember my introductory words. We'd like to make this a conversation as much as possible. Thank you, John.
Okay, well, I'm going to stay here and speak and keep this informal. Thank you very much for those opening words. Let me say it like this. Smart leadership is always a differentiator at any time. But in these hugely complex and tough times, I think the scale of differentiation can be very, very significant indeed. So I guess the question really is, what is smart leadership in these challenging times? That's what I tried to think about saying a few words to start here. And what I'm going to do, as Rob suggested, is give you a little bit of a perspective from my own position in my own organisation, Deloitte. We're an advisory business. We've got over 12,000 people in the UK and another 150,000 people around the world. Our product is our people. Most of the people in an organisation like mine are young, and all of them are very smart. Because so many of them are young, many of the people have not experienced directly the implications and the impact of a downturn such as the one we've got, and that's very, very relevant. So the starting point for me of smart leadership in challenging times like these is to understand a number of things. First of all, to understand how our people, the key assets that I've just said in our business, are impacted in this troubled environment. Secondly, and obviously, I guess, to understand how our market is impacted, what has happened to it and what's going to happen in the future. And then thirdly, and most importantly, to understand our clients' needs and how we can best help them succeed in these times. When our people are confident, and I'm sure this applies to all of your businesses, when our people are confident, when they're motivated, when they're engaged, they will stay focused on our clients' needs. So smart leadership of our people includes a number of aspects where different or special emphasis is needed in these times. First off, our people, to the point you just made then, Rob, our people need to understand the vision and our business goals, and particularly how those are impacted by this environment, as our strategic goal changed as a consequence of this environment. All businesses, of course, need tight management. We've heard that this morning around short-term issues, cost, cash, in times like this. Our people need confidence that this is under control so that they can focus on what is more important, and for us, that is to focus on our clients and the market. Visibility of leadership and communication, always important, but becomes even more important. Leaders must tell it straight. They've got to keep our people informed about the market, about how we're doing, our competitors, how they're doing, and they've got to do this more often and very, very regularly in these times. But this straight talking needs to be overlaid with a tone of optimism, positive, being positive, energy. I'm sure we heard some of that this morning. We have to emphasize that growing markets is only one component of the way a business can succeed. Another big challenge for smart leadership is having a readiness for change. Again, that was just referred to, being flexible. Of course, hunkering down, doing the same thing, saying, well, they might feel safe, but you won't end up winners. Leaders in challenging times also need to be conscious of new difficulties which emerge perhaps only in times like this. Different businesses in different sectors will have different examples of what these new issues might be. But again, just to give you an example in my business, resource and retaining our people is something that we devote vast amounts of time to. We recognise that our people in better economic times have huge opportunities confronting them. And so an enormous amount of our effort goes into keeping our people. But in times like this, the attrition rate has dropped by 50%. So we've now got a different set of problems. So understanding how we need to deal with this very, very different issue is the kind of problem that emerges, which is a different problem in these times. The final point, smart leadership in challenging times is about building for the future, not just surviving the short term. Again, I mentioned that in my opening comments this morning. Of course, we've got to stay close to day-to-day trading, but it's much more about the future, being bold, being innovative, being ready to make change. And the winners of tomorrow will be those where the leaders have the vision and conviction to capitalise on these times.
I'm not sure whether can I be heard. I can be heard. Do you notice anything particularly challenging about much of what you say there, John? Is I suspect a leadership challenge always. What's particularly tough now?
What's different now? Because I think that It's tough all the time. I think what's different now is the continuous need. You can't assume anything. You can't assume. One of the points I make to all of my partners is every day when our people read the newspapers about the hundreds of layoffs in this business or redundancies in this business, they might feel very confident. They're very, very smart people. You can't underestimate the importance of engaging your people and communicating with them. It doesn't matter how smart they are. In these times, you can't underestimate that.
Can I turn it over to Ben? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I think it's very hopeful that so many people come to a conference like this. I think it's a very good sign. And there is a good theory that says that a crisis is too important to waste, because it's a unique opportunity to change things that were very hard to change before. And if that's true, then I've been double lucky, because I arrived at a company in the middle of a crisis, very company specific, and just a few weeks later we had another crisis. So let me first say a few things about the other crisis. First of all, I think the crisis is not just an economic crisis. Sure, there's a financial issue as well, but mainly it's a crisis of confidence. And by the way, we have a third crisis. We have a crisis around climate change. And if you want to understand what it does for leadership, just simply look to what people in the street say about the leaders. If you take journalists and politicians, and I apologize for journalists and politicians in the audience, they were normally at the bottom of the range. Good news for them, other people are now making up for the bottom. It's our bankers and business leaders. And that's a telling story, because that doesn't end at the front door. It is a society that is angry. It's a society that has a problem with trust, who to trust. And it's a society that is looking for certainty in a world that is changing radically. Companies that have to change radically. So how about leadership in an environment like that? I think three things come to the forefront. The first thing is be authentic, be yourself. That's absolutely necessary. By the way, why would you change? You're chosen on who you are for the role to do. Why would you all of a sudden change? So being yourself is a very important element. Second, it's about transparency. If you're not transparent, how can I trust? If you're not predictable in a way, how can I trust? Yes, of course, the world changes, but in leadership, transparency is truly important. And the third element is credibility. Because a leader has to bring his people along. Well, the people change. Today, we live in a very different environment than 10 years ago. And let's learn something from the computer systems. Originally, when you had a computer system, you had a mainframe. All the brains was in the center. And on your desk, you had something that was called the slave. It was simply there to execute. And unfortunately, many organizations are still like that. Now, we have learned that that is not the best way to run a network. If you want to run a network, you distribute your intelligence. Every single part has a little bit of the intelligence and can work together in a much more agile way. That means that we have to look to our own organizations and adapt that to reality. And then you have to do two other things. You have to look in the mirror. Well, I don't look in the mirror, I look to the audience here. And if I look to the audience here, I see 80% male. I see 80% white male. And that's a problem. Because we will have to adapt to a very different mix of talent from around the world to make companies not just agile, but successful and capable of operating in very different environments. And last but not least, you have to get the people to understand the definition of success. Now, each and every one of you and us here, we have our own personal definition of success. If you add them up, not necessarily the definition of success for the organization will come to the surface. So how do you bridge the personal drive and passion that you need in an organization with the ability to create an organization that as a whole is successful to that?
Thank you very much, Ben. As a member of a male, middle-aged white panel, I'm very reluctant to start commenting on diversity. But I do think Ben's raised a really interesting issue here in terms of his comments about this room. And here's one of the only easy generalizations from organizational behavior. Creativity increases with diversity. And I'm sure that's part of Ben's comment in terms of, to be innovative and creative, there's a need for diversity. But could I ask, on your comment about transparency and trust, how do you go about rebuilding trust? Because you weren't here earlier this morning, but we had our own trust survey going on around this meeting, and well, some rather depressing statistics were already quoted this morning about the loss of trust, particularly, may I say, amongst chief executives, trust in chief executives. So I wonder, how does one go about? You can destroy trust, obviously, very fast. How do you rebuild it?
So let me take a personal example. When I arrived at Alcatel-Lucent, that company's population, 80,000 people, in approximately 120 countries around the world, the internal trust was absolutely zero. Zero. So I opened a website called Ask Ben, and I asked everybody, instead of hiring McKinsey or somebody else, I said, you need to help and create not only a strategy, but a way to go forward, and we need to stay in dialogue. Within 2 months, I had almost 12,000 people. And I answered all of them myself, immediately and directly, which is a huge commitment. And the only way I know how to build trust is to take people on the journey. Too often I think we talk about a destination without understanding the way that you reach your destination and the journey you have to make. And you have to build trust every step of the road.
Thank you. Thank you, Ben. Willie, over to you.
Okay, thank you. I think John and Ben have said quite a lot, so I'm not going to say too much other than to say that I genuinely believe that the challenge we face at the moment is by far the most significant challenge that we've faced in many, many years. Speaking from somebody who spent 30 years in the airline business, this is by far the most challenging environment we've ever operated in. And just to put it into some context, last year the airline industry lost about $10.4 billion, and that's excluding about $9 billion mark-to-market losses on fuel hedging. This year the industry is projected to lose about $9 billion, and that's based on an assumed fuel price of about $56 a barrel, which I think is optimistic. To put it into context, after 9/11, which was a dreadful time for the airline industry, industry revenues fell by about 7%. This year, the industry is forecast to lose about 15% of revenues. So the scale of this challenge is much greater than anything we faced in the post-9/11 environment. And Ben has said it, it's a crisis on a number of fronts. We've got weak confidence, both at consumer and at business level. We've got weak economic conditions. We've still got volatile fuel prices, volatile currencies. And we've got a banking system that is not yet functional, although I believe this morning it was fixed, so I'm pleased to hear that. If I think back to my experience at Aer Lingus, I took over as the CEO of Aer Lingus on the 19th of October 2001, just a short period after 9/11. I think it's well known that I didn't apply for the job. But in fact, nobody wanted it, so when I was asked to do it, I didn't hesitate to take it. But what was interesting at that time was the then chairman at Aer Lingus said that he wanted to put me through a formal interview process. So it's nice to know you're the only runner, but you're going to go through a formal process. And part of that was to spend some time with a psychologist doing all of these batteries of psychological tests that you've probably all done. And I obviously got the job, so I passed on the tests. But what was interesting was when I did the debrief with the psychologist, he sat down and he highlighted some issues that I should be aware of. And he said to me that, you're taking this remarkably well. He said, normally when I give feedback on this level, I get quite a lot of resistance from people I'm giving feedback to. And the point I made to him was, knowing that there was no pressure on me to get the job, I was exactly like I would always be, So what that psychologist saw, and what that psychologist wrote about me, was me. And when he described it to me, I was laughing. Even the tough things, I was laughing. And that message of be yourself, to me, is the most important lesson you can ever learn. Because there's no question, when you come under pressure in any environment, but particularly in a tough, stressful business environment, you will revert to form. And anybody who tries to act as a leader or to mimic experiences that they've seen or learned from other people will fail. Because under pressure, you will become exactly the person you are. And I think the greatest example of that is with Ryanair. There is only one Michael O'Leary in this world. And I think we should all really give thanks to but I have seen a lot of people in his organisation try to mimic him. And it's just seen for what it is. It's seen for people trying to mimic somebody else. So that advice of being yourself, I think is the strongest message you can ever get. The other critical message in a time of challenge like this is to be honest with your people. You've heard about it, transparency. And again, that was a very somber message that I learned in that post-9/11 environment. Because all of the people I stood up to speak to and tell them that their jobs were likely to go, knew that that was the case. But the fascinating reaction, pretty much from everybody I spoke to, was to challenge me on why we didn't do anything earlier. That we all knew there was a crisis, we all knew there was a challenge there, but if we'd responded faster to it, maybe the scale of the action that we needed to take would have been less. So you've got to be honest, your people are very intelligent. In many cases, they will know your business better than you do. They will know the challenges and they will know the solutions. So be honest with them. And the final message I would give is I've never seen a crisis that sorts itself out. I've never seen a problem that just disappears, particularly in business. So the sooner you face up to the challenges, recognize them, own up to them, the better it is. And as a leader, I think that's what people expect of you. They expect you to spot the challenges, the crises before anybody else. They expect you to call it ahead of everybody else. And they expect you to act ahead of everybody else. And doing that, I think, gets you certainly on the road to recovery. It doesn't sort the problems out, but it certainly makes it an awful lot easier.
You've heard, as I predicted, from three rather distinctive voices and three very distinctive sectors, different experiences. Now's the point where we really would like to turn it out to a discussion with all of you. This is a room full of absolutely perfect people who will have perfect questions. So please, could you signal arms raised? There's a gentleman over to the left. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Juan Pablo Hernandez. I am from Colombia. I work with Easy Fares, it's an exhibition company. I am very interested about the British Airways case. In Colombia, we have Avianca Airlines, and it's doing extremely well right now in bad times, as you mentioned. And one day I asked to some flight attendant, what this airline is changing a lot. And she said, it's changing a lot because it changed owners. So I am very keen that we are always talking about leadership of the CEO for bad times, but I think the owners also have to change the mindset for bad times, because sometimes leadership in these times are very strong in politics, has to be spend a lot of time talking to the property and convince the owners to make changes. So I would like to hear a little bit how is to run an airline with one owner very fast. I think ownership is a big issue here also.
I'm going to ask, obviously, Willie to respond initially to that, but John may also have a view in his advisory capacity of the role of ownership in terms of leadership under difficult circumstances. So, Willie first, thank you.
I've been CEO at 3 different airlines so far. Aer Lingus was owned by the Irish government, so a single owner. At the time of September 11, the most important thing that the Irish government did both as the government itself but also as the owner of the airline, was to stand back and allow management to face up to the restructuring that was required. My biggest fear at the time of taking over as CEO at Aer Lingus was that the government would either provide Aer Lingus with loan guarantees or indeed some cash. All of that would have been wasted, because I go back to the nature of the challenge that the airline faced at that time. Much of what happened around September 11 was really to accelerate a problem that was there prior to 9/11. So restructuring was necessary, and the owner, the Irish government, needed to recognise that and to give them their credit, because it's a difficult thing for politicians to do. They stood back and allowed management to get on with the restructuring, the scale of restructuring that was necessary. I think most owners, when faced with a business in challenge or in crisis, recognise that tough changes are required and will typically stand back. I don't believe a change of ownership automatically sorts the problems out, and the evidence of that is businesses that are being government owned, that are privatised. The problems still remain, so it's down to the management to address those problems and restructure the business to address the challenges that the business faces.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think the profile or characteristic of ownership can cause fundamentally different approaches in a company. Just to give some examples, what I mean by that is we all talk, particularly did so when the market was better, about private equity. So when a business is owned through a private equity house versus ownership by shareholders, a public company, then the requirements, the goals can be very, very different for such a company. We've now seen in our banking industry here that we've moved from companies that are owned by the shareholders at large through to situations where a major part of the ownership in some of the large banks in this country are owned by government, and that is going to make a fundamental difference to what the requirements might be. Just pick up another angle, there are companies, and it's something Ben mentioned earlier, talking about the green agenda. There are companies where the owners are very, very committed to dealing with those kind of issues, and that ownership, as the owner of the company, quite rightly, can impact upon the management of the business. So, I think ownership does make a difference, a huge difference.
Before we came on stage, we were having a discussion about does it feel different in London to Paris, and I just wonder, to put you on the spot, Ben, how does the ownership issue look like from the perspective of Paris?
Very different. There are cultural differences, and it's one of the things that, if you talk about definition of success, organizations will have to learn if they want to be truly global. If you look to ownership when it is just as a shareholder, you want, wherever you are in the world, you want your returns, and you want to make sure that the returns are healthy and sustainable. But if it comes to your role in addition to that, I think there are different views how society will work from one country to the other, from one culture to the other, and I think we've got to take good notice of that. If you talk about green, I'm pretty sure that after Copenhagen, less than 9 months from now, 6-7 months from now, we will live in a very different world where governments and regions will impose very different measures to the companies in order to succeed what the task is that is at hand. And how that translates into behavior has to do with not just the direct bottom line in the short term, but also the context in which owners look to their organizations.
Hi, I'm Rose Bentley from North Lowlands. We talked a lot today about trust, trust that businesses have for people they work with, and about CEOs in particular, and lots of difficult things I think that all of you will have asked of your employees in recent times. So my question is, all of you, in addition to running business, are also guardians of a brand, and high-profile brands at that. So what does the panel think is the role of the brand in engendering trust in their employees and in keeping them committed at difficult times?
Can we we take the, there's another question, we'll take 2 minutes. There's one just in front.
Hello, Trevor Huff from Oracle Corporation. When taking a new role or finding your companies or your businesses in new environments, you have to drive change. From a people perspective, you have the choice between driving change with your existing people and identifying who the right talent is, or bringing in talent to your organization. How do you choose between those? And when you're talking about your own internal talent, how do you find those people who are your change agents?
Thank you very much. I'm going to start with the trust issue and the brand as a source of trust during difficult times. And maybe, Willie, the obvious place to start might be you. But
I think your comment is it's very important. I think the value of a brand in a time of challenge is very significant. I think it's recognised that in times like this, people will move to brands that they trust. So therefore, having pride in your brand, that's one of the strongest feelings that I had when I joined British Airways. It really struck me at how proud people were to work for British Airways. I'd expected to feel some of that, but it was almost overpowering. And this was an incredibly strong feeling, very emotional, great attachment to it. And I think that is very important because people want to see it succeed, and it definitely carries an awful lot of weight. And I think anybody in a time of significant change like this would be very foolish to do anything that undermines the brand values that people hold true and hold dear in an organisation. And I know that's the experience that we've had at British Airways. I think it's very important. I think you can actually motivate people to do things that you might not expect them to do because of the attachment that they have to the brand, because the pride that they have in the brand, because the trust they have in the brand. That's not something that you can take advantage of. I think it's something that you can definitely use because it motivates people. It does bring people together, and I think it's particularly important and particularly valuable at a time like this.
I should say that each of the chief executives present have been credited with transformational changes of one kind or another. And I guess what's behind the question is the extent to which sometimes these changes might undermine or threaten certain brand values. And I just wonder, in the context of that, Ben, in particular with both your current experience at Alcatel-Lucent, but also your previous experience with BT, your comments about this, the significance of the brand and the extent to which this can create issues.
So I think we can all agree rapidly that brand is crucial. But brand is a reflection of mostly customer experience. And here is, in a time of crisis, a very difficult balance between cost and customer experience. And very often you see in a time of crisis that customer experience is basically put aside to bring cost to the forefront. So basically the message is just kidding when it is about customer experience. I think customers always come first. Always. Which means that the brand has to be not just protected, but built in difficult times. I think to be defensive in difficult times around your brand is a basic mistake. I think if in difficult times you go in the offensive with your customer relationship and your customer experience. And you take your cost there where it doesn't affect the relationship between the organization and its customers.
Well, I think I don't see any contradiction between improving your cost base and improving your customer experience.
It's where you take the cost.
I think often people see that if you're trying to reduce your cost, it must come at a cost of the customer experience. I think that's rubbish, and I think there's plenty of evidence of that. Terminal 5 is a fantastic customer experience today. Fantastic customer experience today. But it means that British Airways can deliver a better customer experience, and our customers are telling us it's the best they've ever had in a much lower cost environment. I think using the internet as a distribution channel for airlines has proven to be a fantastic win-win experience as well. It's a very cheap distribution channel So it's facilitated billions of savings to the airline industry, but it's given much greater power to the consumer because you now have much more visibility, clarity around price. So you can reduce your cost base and improve customer experience. And I think that's an important message because too often people think it's one or the other. I think there's lots of examples where you can actually do both together.
Rob, can I just try and perhaps a slightly different angle and pick up both questions actually, because I can see a connection because I echo the observations about brand and the vital importance of it. I think one of the really complex things is to think about the emotional attachment that people have to brand. And it's the sort of the symbol of the organisation, and for many it's the brand itself rather than the organisation that people focus upon. And if I go back about 7 years here, and I'm sure many people in the audience will recall that there was another big player in our industry called Arthur Andersen, and Arthur Andersen failed. It had a huge brand, and perhaps more than any of the competitors in our industry, that company had done a fantastic job in causing their people to be proud and very, very closely attached to that brand. And on one day, we hired 4,000 people in London and the offices around the UK, and then many more tens of thousands around the world from Arthur Andersen, all in one day, and brought them into our organisation. So this is my point about the change. All these new people coming into an organisation who had been hugely attached and proud of their brand and that label, and the task that we face of trying to capture the hearts and minds and value of those people and switch them to what was then a new brand and a new label. And I think it is a very, very complex and very, very difficult task to build the emotional attachment to a brand. But if you do it, then, and of course the same applies with your customers and your clients, then the sustainable value associated with that is just enormous.
So the second question, picking up on this, is this balance between internal and external talent in order to drive change. Ben?
So first of all, the answer is, to me, yes and yes. You need both. You need to have people who stand back and ask the question because they have not seen the movie before. And you need a few people who have seen the movie before so can tell you why things are happening in the way they're happening. And finding the talent, in my view, is probably the most important intuition of leadership. There is, of course, a lot of basis that has nothing to do with intuition. It's performance, previous performance, the way you get feedback on 360 and the rest. But you have an individual choice to make. You have to make a choice of an individual into an organization. So somebody may be a star in Oracle, but will suffer when that person goes to SAP or the other way around. So the issue here is you have to have judgment over and above the results that you have in front of you. And if you don't have the guts to use your instinct and trust your judgment, then probably you're in the wrong position.
I would agree with Ben. I'll talk just briefly about my experience at Aer Lingus. Shortly after I took over as CEO, I met with the CEO of another major airline, and he said to me, he wished me luck. And he said, you guys at Aer Lingus are fantastic in our prices. So he said, I know you'll get through this. And before I was able to respond, he said, but you've had more than anybody else, so you should be. And it struck me that in that was this message of how people do enjoy prices. So you face a challenge, you go through this period, you restructure, you think you've got the job done, you relax, and surprisingly you find yourself back in another crisis again. I think the value of bringing in new people is that they ask the questions that the people who've been there for years are afraid to ask or have forgotten to ask. And I think having that balance between the experience that's in the business and new people who will challenge you, who will say, why are you doing this? This is madness. Can you not do it in a different way? So you can certainly do it with the people that are in the business. But I've personally found having new people around who will challenge the accepted wisdom, who will ask questions that maybe should be asked in a time of change, can be very, very powerful.
More questions, please. Two gentlemen near the front. Sorry, we didn't hear that.
David Lee from Aon. This morning we had a fascinating discussion about reward for great leaders, which seemed to start and finish with the size of the pay packet. I'd be interested in the panel's view about whether this crisis might create a new paradigm with a greater emphasis on the privilege of leadership, the intrinsic value of work, and the obligation on talented people to make a better society, and perhaps less of an emphasis on me, myself, I, and personal group.
Thank you very much. As before, can we also just take the second question? We'll come straight back to you. Thank you. Yeah.
Francisco Liendo from the MBA program Exchange Program. I want to bring back the thing you mentioned about diversity. And I want to tell a little story. My country, our president is female, and she was doing very badly in the polls before the crisis. But as her government prioritized protection and not growth, these days, all these years in the crisis, her popularity and the one from the government has risen a lot, almost doubled. Yeah? Because the population valued to be protected and not all this risk-taking that led into the crisis. So what I would like you to elaborate a little more is if and how should we encourage diversity and bring in some other perspectives like gender perspective into leadership?
Thank you very much. We'll take the pay issue first from David. And I'm sitting next to a gentleman who I think, my watch is corrected, a couple of days' time is working for free. And so are some of his colleagues. So I guess inevitably we'll start with Willie, but we'll have everyone comment. Thank you.
Yeah, it's going to be very easy for me to talk about this. I've in the past given up bonus. I've said I'm working for nothing in July. Money is not what motivates me, but I've always had jobs that are very well paid. And I think it's important for us to put this into context. I love my job. I love working. I always have. I don't like going on holiday because I prefer to work. I really enjoy it. But to say that money is not important, full stop, I think everybody that says that is lying at one level or another. Money is important. It's a basic need. We all need it. My lifestyle does not match the salary that I get, not by a long distance. So it's of little pain to me to say that I'm going to work for July for nothing. It's not putting me under any financial strain. It does put others in my business under significant financial strain if they want to do that. And I've made it very clear to people. I know the press have blown this completely out of proportion as, well, that's a surprise, I suppose. I've made it clear to people that I was not asking them to do what I had done. In fact, I said it very clearly. I can afford to work for a month without pay. I know that there are lots of people, if not the majority of people in my business, that cannot afford to do that. And I'm not expecting them to do that. But what I was expecting people to do was to stand back and ask themselves, what can I do to help? In a time of need, what can I do to help make a difference? And I hope coming out of all of these restructuring and crises that people will reflect more on the value that they get from work. I get great value from getting up in the morning and going to work. I always have done. I've been very fortunate to have jobs that are challenging. I've been very fortunate to have jobs that are well rewarded. But the real reward I get is from facing up to a challenge, particularly challenges that people say cannot be overcome, and beating them. It's going back to what you said at the beginning. It's facing up to your mistakes and saying, I got it wrong and I'm sorry, but I'm going to fix it, and fixing it and making it better than you ever believed possible. There is so much more reward from something like that than there is from picking up a paycheck at the end of the month. So, balance is required here. I don't think anybody is going to say, let's all work for nothing. I think that would be foolish. But I think we can value more the reward that we get from doing a job well, the reward that we get from having people saying, well done. It still fascinates me how people will respond to a thank you or a well done. You know, to slap somebody on the shoulder and say, great job. To send somebody a text and say, you know, that was a great performance. To send somebody a short email to say, you know, you did a great job. It's amazing how that motivates people and how that rewards people. And maybe we've lost sight of that. Maybe we do need to do a little bit more of that.
I'm going to jump across to John, because in his opening remarks he was talking about understanding what people want, and smart people in particular. And I suspect what smart people want is all sorts of things other than money. It's just a kind of base level.
They do. Well, the first observation I would make is I could get shouted down here, but I'm reasonably confident that many people in leadership roles, not just chief executives, historically have viewed the value of their role as being something other than just the money. I think, human nature is such that in order to have an enjoyable life, and most people want to have one, then there's going to be a variety of things that they enjoy, and many people, particularly those people in leadership roles, like to be challenged. They like the challenge. They like to be winners, and I think the vast majority of people I know in leadership roles do feel privileged to have the roles that they've got, and very lucky to have the roles they've got for a wide range of things. For the last 30 years, I've been self-employed, so I'm not in directly the same situation as employees. But when I look at our own people in our organisation, I think the smartest people who make the biggest contributions are entitled to be rewarded at a higher level. I think there is an entitlement there. I agree with everything that Willie has just said about other things you can do to motivate people. And if you don't do those things, then you're not going to retain the very, very smart people. But I do think that those who make bigger contributions because perhaps they're smarter, perhaps they work harder, perhaps they devote themselves more to an organisation, I don't think there's anything wrong at all in those people earning what is their fair share of the rewards that can be paid in total to the huge group of people that you might have in business.
Ben, I'm going to ask you to do the impossible, which is answer two questions, but because there was a second question as well about diversity and how do we get more diversity. But I'm sure you have a view on the monetary reward question under the current circumstances, which I think is behind the question.
Sure.
Is the game changed?
Sure, and there was a modest applause for the question. So there's a groundswell. There's a feeling that something is wrong, and I have to. I just remembered an article 3 years ago from a CEO of a European company who complained that being the CEO of this company had 100,000 people around the world was a dog's job, and people should be happy that he would take this responsibility. And as a reaction, he got 1,000 letters from people who said that they would be willing to do his job for half the price. So there is something to be absolutely 2 feet on the ground. You have to be lucky to be. You're certainly not automatically the best, because who knows what the best is. You have to be lucky to be where you are. And if you're lucky to be where you are, then you have to look at the circumstances in which you operate and the environment in which you operate. And you have to be transparent, certainly when it comes to the issue of pay. But I had my personal experience 4 months ago, when I was hired by the company. There was a kind of formula about pay. Well, I was hired within the hour, so there was not too much time to negotiate, so to say. And as part of that was a hefty bonus. And I decided that taking a bonus at this point in time was not a good thing to do. I got one reaction, one email. It was a non-issue. So here's the issue about money. Money is a relative form. If I earn 3 million and I say, now I'm only going to earn 2 million, is then the issue done? No. It's not the absolute, it's the relative point. And your question had another element that I find even more important, and that is, what's your role in society? Business leaders, in my view, have a responsibility to speak up, not just on behalf of their companies, but also as a leader, as an opinion leader, and have to participate in public debate on a variety of issues, and have to bring what they have to say and what they have to contribute in order for societies to develop. Pay is a little part of that. It has to fit. But there is no token you can give, token you can offer, so to say, to be off the hook. You will be on the hook, whatever the amount is. Now, on diversity, I have two remarks. First of all, diversity is a mindset. If I look in the mirror, and I like what I see, and I think that's what 99.999% of the people do, they go out and they hire what they see. I had a nice anecdote. 10 years ago, I worked for Lucent in the US, and they are the proud owner of Bell Labs. And Bell Labs was engaged in a wide variety of things, and one of them was the research to the black hole of the universe. And they won a Nobel Prize for that. And the leader was a Greek American. And when I was sitting down with that team, something like 60% of the people there were Greek Americans. Now, either there is something spectacular in the DNA of Greek Americans to be located and linked with the black hole in the universe, or there was something completely different. It was simply that the leader, as a Greek American, liked what he saw in the mirror, and that's what he hired. And he hired a top team, but it wasn't diverse. So looking in the mirror is not good enough. You have to become uncomfortable. And I think leadership has to challenge itself on the levels of comfort, in direct interaction with your colleagues, in direct interaction with the people, and in the people that you bring on board. It is uncomfortable to have very different environments. But in my view, it's the only way that you get the level of integration between markets and organizations.
Thank you very much. And I'm aware of our time constraints, and at least one of our panel has to leave very fast. But just by way of conclusion, I did quote Jeff Immelt from this morning, and his comment, leadership for the 21st century, I'm not sure. What he actually said was some of the fundamentals remain the same. Good leaders will learn, they will execute, they will carry accountability, they will deliver performance, and so on. And then he kind of scratched his head and said, but maybe we need more adaptability, we need more fast connection with stakeholders and shareholders, we should embrace uncertainty, we need to mobilize people fast, we need more transparency. I think many of those sentiments are behind some of what you've just heard from these three speakers on the panel, but by way of conclusion, leadership now, different, radically different. John?
Different, but not radically different as well.
Ben?
Radically different.
Radically different.
I don't know.
Okay, we should have had that as a scale question on the trust questionnaire, but you had a range of responses there, and as I promised at the beginning, a range of different people from different sectors. So thank you very much for being here, all of you, and thanks very much for the question.